Thank you all. And thanks for coming out under these circumstances. Usually when I have my notes, I have this habit of going to my finger to turn the page. So look how I adapted. I created these little Post-its so I can turn them differently. Let me begin by sharing what brings me here and why is it that I have something to say on arguably this most vital topic. I speak from personal and from professional experience. When my sons were about 5 and 9, the circumstances of the divorce I went through had me with them full time. So I raised them. They're in their mid-30s now, and I'm still raising them. Sometimes people ask, is this talk just for young children? Any age. It's a lifelong experience. It really, really doesn't stop. My approach to what I call the human condition, that's really what my passion is. I look at our experiences, about the way we live and how we engage life, and I look at things differently. Like, what do we need to do to thrive? And typically, we have to break free from the rule book of how we operate. So I am not a traditionalist. Many years ago, I was giving a talk on relationships, and the gentleman in the audience, you could tell he had an attitude by the tone of his voice, and he said to me, "You know, you sound like an idealist." And I smiled and said, "Well, thank you. We need some of that, don't we?" So tonight we're going to talk about raising resilient children, what we mean by this term, and how we deal with things like anxiety and depression, or whatever diagnostic labels have been thrown at children. If we look at the rate of anxiety, depression, and a host of other disorders that young children and adolescents experience, it's actually an epidemic proportion. Maybe 1 out of 3 kids. Now, if an epidemic hit us, as it is right now, we try to understand the cause. But with our children and in our relationships, we don't. The first book I wrote 25 years ago was called The Art of Intimacy, and it was about relationship. And I proposed that the fact that half of marriages end in divorce is the lesser issue. The larger issue is that the majority of intact marriages are far from happy. So my thesis was, if we play by the same rule book that creates those results, the problem's with us. If marriage were a corporation, it would be bankrupt. We would never accept that from business. Similarly, it makes no sense to continue to play by the rule book that's creating this distress in our children. As I go along this evening, I'll break at certain points to take questions, but certainly write down any questions you have, so at the end of the talk, we'll have plenty of time to move into it. So what I'm proposing is that this distress, the anxiety, the depression that we see amongst most children is actually not clinical. It doesn't mean there's something wrong with them. It means there's something wrong with the environment in which we're raising them. And that's what we need to take a look at. So playing by the same game plan, by the same rule book that creates this disastrous distress, makes no sense to follow. We focus. Now, I'm speaking now to this audience, and I'm not assuming that one size fits all. But in this part of the world, which is more affluent, is more focused on grades and achievement, we lose balance. We focus on giving our kids everything they need to succeed in life, to achieve, and to get ahead. But we don't focus on the foundation of life, and that's what we'll be discussing this evening. And one doesn't preclude the other. Resilience, emotional intimacy, authentic self-worth don't get in the way of prospering academically. They create the foundation for it. But let's take a look at the notion of childhood. Not too long ago, certainly 20 or 30 years ago, childhood wasn't so hurried or rushed. When I work with parents now, and I do work with adolescents as well, I see schedules that are so intense, so rigorous, that I see them as ruinous. Childhood, historically, is called childhood for a reason. We were children. And in that childhood, there was time for play, wonder, curiosity, creativity. I remember my own childhood. So much downtime when my brother and I would go outside and create games for ourselves. We weren't overscheduled or overburdened. What happens when we lose the experience, when children are deprived of the experience of downtime, of creativity, of wonder? They suffer. By the way, I maintain that if someone has wonder and curiosity, they will not be depressed. Depression is a disconnection from wonder and curiosity and creativity. Let's just look at the word wonderful. There was a time when wonderful presumably meant something full of wonder, like a great rainbow, something full of awe and wonder. How do we use the word wonderful now? Come home with a great report card and say, that's wonderful. Is it full of wonder? Wonderful now means job well done. Can you see the problem here as a culture? We've lost a sense of reverence, awe, wonder, and creativity, and we suffer for it, and children suffer for it. What do we want for our children? We say we want happiness. We want them to be happy and successful, but we focus primarily on the successful. And we don't really take a look at happiness. What I'm going to share with you this evening, if this were taught in school, if we taught emotional resilience, emotional intelligence, deep, meaningful levels of communication, it would be an entirely different world. So what I'm going to provide this evening is the big picture, which is where we're starting, what I call the macro, why the system is wrong, and then we will burrow down to the specifics, to what we can do as parents to create different relationships with our kids. My book, The Possibility Principle, speaks to the fact that we come into life in a state of pure possibility. You know, we don't know what our personality or identity will be yet or what our life will look like, but at very young ages, those possibilities begin to narrow. Think about how the possibilities of your children experiencing authentic, genuine self-esteem, self-worth get narrowed when we hyper-focus on the productivity. So as parents, no matter how loving and nurturing we are, our kids are still struggling. So again, I'm proposing we need to operate from a new game plan. And I will share personal anecdotes with you this evening. And when we're taking questions, feel free to ask me anything you want, and I'm happy to share it. So what do I mean by this word resilient? Well, before I answer, anybody have an idea? What do we mean by resilience? Thoughts? Yes.
Just being able to roll with the highs and lows of life, no matter what it brings you, just staying open-minded that at the end of the day, things just always work out in the end.
Okay, yes?
Keep going.
Keep going. Rolling with the highs and lows and just keep going. Any other thoughts? Okay.
Bouncing back from setbacks.
Yes, that's what the dictionary says. Not that the dictionary is correct. The dictionary still has incorrect definitions for gravity, which was changed in 1919 with Einstein's relativity, which is bizarre. But yes, the dictionary says the ability to bounce back. So life is challenging and hard. And how do we provide resilience for our children? We're going to move into that very shortly. It's resourcefulness, the ability to bounce back. It's a foundation for navigating life. Part of resilience is developing authentic self-esteem. It's a term we use often, self-esteem. How would you define it? Thoughts? No one?
Self-confidence.
Self-confidence, yes.
So it's a positive sense of self.
Positive sense of self, okay. How do we help children develop self-esteem?
Allow them to make mistakes.
And in fact, it would probably be good not even to call it a mistake. because a mistake or the concept of mistake or failure is damaging. Imagine watching a toddler stand up and take their first steps and fall down. You wouldn't say the toddler failed. You wouldn't say the toddler made a mistake. They haven't yet learned. So a mistake is a snapshot that we take in a moment of something and freeze it. So rather than adhere to mistakes to free us, we need to cultivate a learning experience which is not concerned with mistakes at all. Now, as a culture, I think the term self-esteem is terribly misunderstood, because most people would say what gives their children self-esteem would be wonderful grades, athletic achievement, being popular, having lots of friends. But none of that is derived from self. That's derived from external success and gratification. I call that other esteem. And as a culture, we seek other esteem. I'm going to hold off on that now because I'll be going into that in depth in terms of what we as parents need to model for our kids and how we can cultivate authentic self-esteem ourselves and model it for them rather than telling them that that's what we need to do. So I see two pillars for the foundation of resilient children. One is authentic self-esteem, and the other one is emotional intelligence. Now, again, we receive no education in how to accomplish this. Schools aren't really much teaching it. Children need childhood. They need unscheduled, unburdened time, but we run up against the belief and the theme that we have to compete. We have to compete as parents with what other parents are doing for their kids to try to get them ahead. I'll share a story about this. When my younger son was in 5th grade, he came home one day with a disappointing report card. At least I was disappointed. I gave him the typical parental speech about his report card. He looked at me. He said, "Dad, you know I'm just in 5th grade?" I said, "Alex, I'm well aware." He said, "You know my grades don't count yet." I said, "I know." So I gave him a talk. I said to him, it's like the exhibition season in baseball. The scores don't count, but you get into shape. This is to get you into shape. So when your grades do count in high school, you'll be on board. He said, "I tell you what, when the game is on and my grades count, I'll show up. You're going to have to trust that. In the meantime, I'm just a kid. Would you let me be a kid?" Shut my mouth. I was speechless in that moment because there was a wisdom coming through. And he proved me right. He did. He needed playtime. He needed relaxation. He needed curiosity. He needed creativity. All of those things gave him the grounding and the foundation to navigate life. But it never ends. He's 32 years old now and is going through a painful breakup that was unexpected with his girlfriend, and he's in pain. But he has resilience, and so we work on it. I'm just a kid. Would you let me just be a kid? And when that happened, I wrote that article, which you can find online. It's called "I'm Just a Kid." If we want happiness for our children, if we want them to have authentic self-esteem, we're going to need to learn to cultivate that and rethink our relationship with our kids and our messages. But we have to get off this conveyor belt that tells us what we should be doing. It's a myth, but it's real, because we tend to follow consensual belief. And that consensual belief is all about peer pressure. We as parents experience peer pressure. Our kids experience peer pressure, and the compression is so tight that they unravel. And then they are taken to therapists who throw diagnoses at them. Often those diagnoses I am not in agreement with, because they are put forth as clinical diagnosis, like you have an anxiety disorder. Well, very often, the way I see it, is it isn't a clinical disorder, it's a situational disorder. If you're operating from rules and a game plan that are unlivable and inhospitable. The problem is the anxiety and the depression is situational, not clinical. So we can change it by changing the situation. So success and happiness do not preclude one another. If we focused first on happiness, on emotional intelligence, and developing authentic self-esteem, that is the foundation. From there, you can go after success. But if we ignore the underpinning and the foundation and just focus on the success, these kids are going to unravel, the majority of them. I was working with a high school senior remotely by Skype who lives in London. And he was talking to me about his fears of not getting into Oxford. If he didn't get into Oxford, he was a failure. There's the word failure. I worked with a kid who is in an Ivy League college, and in her sophomore year, she couldn't decide what to major in, and she was so terrified of making a mistake that she actually took a leave of absence rather than make a mistake and choose the wrong major. That mindset is not to navigate life and embrace uncertainty and get in the flow and make changes as you go along. Embracing uncertainty is an important quality for overcoming anxiety. So, what is our role as parents? To be their academic managers, or to help develop children that we can cultivate with genuine self-worth, with the ability to communicate effectively, and with emotional intelligence? So, we need to rethink our relationship with our children. Now, one of the ways that I learned to do that was based upon how I was raised. I was gifted, I was blessed, I had emotionally intelligent parents. And what I learned from them is that they shared the stories of their life with me. Not just the good and the success, but the struggles and the challenges. My dad shared with me, he had his own business, and when I was perhaps in my mid-teens or late teens, he shared with me that he went through some years in this business where he was really struggling. And he'd lie awake at night, scared and frightened about what would happen. And I felt honored that he shared that with me, because in particular, he overcame it and succeeded. Typically, parents don't share that. What did that do for me? When I reached the point some years later where I had some challenges in my business, I had a reference point. Dad went through it and he's okay. Could you imagine if I didn't have that reference point and that information, I would have thought I'm a failure. So the first thing I want to share this evening, moving into content, is that we need to share our life narrative with our children. Otherwise, we just have a transactional relationship. We're managing them and we're telling them what to do. Could you imagine denying them the gift of your life story? Your childhood, your ups and downs, your hopes and wishes, your disappointments, even what you're working on now. So I was raised that way, so it came naturally to me. So I raised my sons that way. It's a small sample size, but I see their success in life. And I see in my working with adolescents, teenagers, college students, this absolute desert. It's just devoid of their parents having shared deeper aspects of themselves with their children. I'll ask questions around their parents, and they'll shrug their shoulders. I don't know. The reality is, they don't really know their parents, other than how their parents motivate them, pay for them, discipline them, and guide them in their academic achievement. But their parents haven't shared their life story. It's tragic. You know, as a culture, we talk about the loss of storytelling, the loss of mentors. Well, part of what we should be doing is sharing our life story. Sometimes parents will say, I don't want to burden my children. Now, I'm not suggesting that we shouldn't have a reasonable balance. We should always have balance. And there are some things that discreetly we should not share with them because we don't want to burden them. But that balance isn't met by only sharing the good, so we act as though we are perfect parents. But we're not. We all struggle. It's the human condition. But the gift of sharing struggle and what you strive for and what you seek to achieve, that is golden. Because that's the quality that we want them to have, and that's a piece of resilience as well. So in rethinking our relationship with our children, we want to tell them of our challenges, our struggles, and our hopes, and not be concerned about what our children think of us. Because by not sharing the pieces that we're concerned about, the message we're really giving them is if we're concerned about what they think of us, they're going to go through life concerned about what others think of them. That is the opposite of genuine self-esteem, isn't it? We need to try to model for them what they want to become, and it is not too late. It's never too late. So, embracing your vulnerability and modeling that for them is a good thing. Now, by vulnerability, I don't mean gross fears. Vulnerability is the piece of ourselves that we tend to hide from others. The message we get in our culture about self-esteem is completely backward. We're taught to act strong. Sometimes we tell kids to act strong. It may be more pertinent for boys than girls. Acting strong is acting. Acting strong is weak. But if you can take your insecurity and share it openly, you're creating genuine self-esteem, because that means I'm not afraid of what you think of me because I've shared my self-doubt and my insecurity. It works. And when you can model that for your children, how powerful. Think about any insecurity or fear that you have, and think about how when you don't hide it and disguise it and open it up, you feel better. That's how you grow. So one of the things we want to model for kids is embracing our vulnerability. And we'll move into that in a bit when we talk about emotional intelligence. Kids need two things: emotional intelligence and authentic self-esteem. Has anybody seen Tom Hanks' new movie about Mr. Rogers? Yeah. Oh, it is incredible. And the previous movie of a year or two ago. What a gift. Mr. Rogers taught emotional intelligence. Mm-hmm. Now, it's just a term so far. We're going to move into it and discuss what emotional intelligence really is. Now, presumably, we as parents may not have any more emotional intelligence than our children have. So let's learn together. You see, as parents, we have an opportunity to get a redo on our own childhood. Whatever wasn't as good as it should be, we can heal our own inner child by stepping into emotional intelligence with our children and moving forward. I really, really recommend everyone see Tom Hanks's Mr. Rogers. Just excellent. So, what is emotional intelligence? What do you think this term means? Thoughts? Yes. To be able to express your feelings and emotions. The whole range of feelings and emotions? Okay. Yes.
Understand and regulate your emotions and identify other people's emotions?
So,
and respond to it?
Good piece, to be able to perceive and understand other people's feelings and to regulate. So regulate doesn't mean suppress, right? So I'm jumping ahead, but one of the things I teach is this. If I can learn to see my feeling and not become my feeling, then I can communicate it. So if I teach an adult or a child to say, you know, I'm feeling really angry, let me tell you why, that's an effective communication because they're not acting angry, right? Now, of course, if it's a positive emotion like love, Well, different rules. You want to act lovingly. So regulate is not the same as suppress. Other thoughts about emotional intelligence, what this means? Yes?
Maybe understanding where it's coming from, what's causing it.
What the source of the feeling is?
Yeah.
Okay. So thought and feeling work in tandem. This is a main theme in my new book. The moment we have a thought, the thought summons up the accompanying emotion that attaches to it. And then when you're in that feeling, it spirals and you pick up another thought that is comparable to that. When you can learn to see your thought and not become your thought, and see your feeling and not become your feeling, that is profoundly different. That's when you can enter into a mindfulness and a wisdom. And it may sound hard to do. It isn't. It's no harder than going to the gym and working out 3 times a week, or doing whatever you do to train your body, or doing detoxing for health. It's not hard. It just hasn't entered the mainstream of culture yet. So, part of emotional intelligence is identifying what I feel, and it's seeing what it is that you feel. We can only do this by communicating, by asking questions. Are feelings right or wrong? What do you think? No? There's no wrong feelings? Okay. Well, if I say to you, it's hot in here, I make an objective statement. It's hot in here. You can say, no, Mel, it isn't. If I say, I feel hot, can you tell me I'm wrong? By the way, this isn't the topic for tonight's conversation entirely, but I'll delve into it. The key to challenging discourse and communication is to speak subjectively. Don't get into arguments about objective things, because they go nowhere, and we invalidate each other. Ultimately, it's, this is what I feel, do you care how I feel? Now, as parents, if we say we love our children, then we want to develop the resilience for them to open up and feel safe and share how they feel. Now, when they share how you, first, that's what you want to cultivate in them. When they share how they feel, the goal is not to invalidate it. Now, the concept of validation psychologically, I think, is misunderstood, and misunderstood by therapists in large part. Validating doesn't mean I agree. Validating means I care how you feel, and if I don't understand how you feel, I want to find out. So validating is to have a curiosity and an inquiry and move into the feeling and understand why do you feel that way. But feelings aren't right or wrong. So we want to develop from kids the opportunity to share their feelings. How do we do that? We share our feelings. This is not about teaching. It is about modeling. So think to yourselves about what feelings you experience that you choose not to share with your children because it feels like foreign territory, because it feels uncomfortable and disquieting. And think to yourself, how can I share my feelings without intruding on their well-being? What we tell our kids has little impact on them. What we model for them has a tremendous impact on them. I learned this because for years I was modeling and giving my speeches and thought my kids were paying no attention. Until one of their friends came over once and said, Mr. Schwartz, can I talk to you? And I said, sure. And he said, my son Jesse had been sharing so much of what he learned from me, and so now his friend wanted to talk to me about his girlfriend and his relationship. I didn't know my kids were ever listening to me. Share your vulnerability. Share your feelings. That helps provide resilience. Again, I'm not talking about tilting over to the place of burdening your kids. You know, my father told me his story about his financial challenges once they were no longer challenges. So he didn't worry me at that point. He gave me a framework for how we negotiate life. So, validating feelings, asking your children, how do you feel? I don't know. Sometimes we say to people, what are you thinking? And the answer is nothing. That's ludicrous. Are you ever thinking nothing unless you're meditating? But when they say nothing, it means we don't want to share it or we think it's not important. So the key quality here, a large component to cultivating resilience in children, is to develop their emotional intelligence. And we're going to move just a little bit more deeply into communication and how we do that. Questions or comments on this piece about emotional intelligence? Make sense? Any piece that you don't agree with, please challenge me. It's fine. Okay. Real conversations. We don't often have real conversations. What do I mean? I work with a therapist who's in therapy with me, and I do supervision with him as well, professional supervision. He wants one of his sons to go into therapy, but his son is resistant. I don't need therapy, he says to his father. I say to the dad, have you shared with him that you're in therapy? No. Why wouldn't you share that? Why wouldn't you normalize this process and say it's like having a coach in the gym or a coach in anything you need? Because we're reluctant to share our stories. We need to have real conversations. When my other son, not the son who said I'm just a kid, when my other son, Jesse, was in 5th grade, I got a phone call from his 5th grade teacher. She needed to speak to me. So I went off to school. It was 1992, and it was the 500th anniversary of Columbus's invasion. And she said to me, we have a problem. We have a Columbus Day celebration for 500 years, and Jesse won't participate. I said, did he tell you why? And she said, yes, he told me why. Because Columbus did these bad things and these bad things, why are we celebrating him? I said, well, I support his decision. The way to cultivate intellectual curiosity is not just focus on grades. What do you think? What do you think about what the book says? What do you think about what the teacher says? Cultivate curiosity, folks. If you cultivate intellectual curiosity, the grades will take care of themselves. What do you think? Have real conversations, not just, why didn't you get an A? What's with the B+? You can do better. Or what's with the C? We have to cultivate and stimulate curiosity about all things. Because we end up being so hurried and so busy in our lives, we pass by one another like ships in the night. Our relationships are transactional. The kids are overwhelmed by being overscheduled. Again, they have lost any sense of play and wonder and curiosity. And please don't take this the wrong way. This is unintentional child abuse. It is. How could it be anything different when we are depriving children of the developmental necessities to become healthy, resilient young adults and adults? We have to stop abusing them, even if it means dealing with our own anxiety and fear that our kids are not keeping up with everyone else's kids. The goal is not to keep up. The goal is to develop the foundation for them to thrive, and then they'll soar past the other people that you're worried about competitively. Questions on this? So when we have real conversations, we want to know how they feel. We don't want to invalidate their feelings. We want to inquire why they feel the way they do. And we want to develop empathy. Empathy is getting in their shoes and knowing what it feels like to be them. It doesn't mean you have to have a solution to the problem at hand. The solution is secondary. What's more important is the love expressed by simply getting in their shoes and being there with them. When I do couples work, I often see, and I'm stereotyping gender-wise here, what I often see doing couples work is that if a woman expresses a problem or a challenge, and the man, her partner, offers a solution, she gets really upset. She doesn't want the solution. She doesn't want him to fix it. She wants him to care. Kids need to be cared about on an entirely new level. So developing empathy is essential. I recall Jesse's bar mitzvah. I recall the speech I gave. And in the speech, I said something like this, long time ago, but best my memory can recall. I said something like this: I am not proud of you for having so many friends. I'm not proud of you for being so well-liked or being the captain of your baseball team. I am not proud of you for how well you're doing in school. I am not proud of you for how much your grandparents love you. I am proud of you because you are who you are. That is genuine self-esteem. The other stuff is other esteem. Around that time in his life, Jesse and I were in Manhattan, in the Village. And I was ordering a slice of pizza somewhere at an outdoor stand. And Jesse said to me, "Can I have a couple of dollars?" Absent-mindedly, I handed it to him. Since we were in Manhattan, I was paying attention to where he was walking. And there was a homeless person on the street about 40 feet down. And he just wanted to give him the money. Warmed my heart, right? That's what I'm proud of. I'm proud of who he is. In hindsight, he has said to me, I wished I had studied harder in high school and in college. It would have enabled me to do some things that he thinks he can't do now. I insist that he can. But he doesn't regret that he wasn't driven at the expense of play and having fun. It helped develop him into a wonderful young man, which he is. So authentic, genuine self-esteem means that we are not proud of our kids based upon who they're going to become if they work hard enough. There is no future moment for authentic self-esteem. It has to be a sense of feeling cherished and loved right now. Now, many of us, most of us, don't feel that way about ourselves, honestly. So again, the impetus, the motivation for helping your children do this means that you have an opportunity to grow and develop and learn together how this is done. Any questions? Can you imagine a classroom where you're graded not on your answers, but on asking the best question? Teacher asks a question, you think you have the answer, the hands shoot up, and it's kind of rote and predictable. You know the answer? Yes, that's the right answer. Imagine an educational system built around asking the best question. How interesting and provocative that would be. And there's no wrong questions or bad questions. And good questions don't have quick answers. Good questions stop you in the moment and make you, let me think about that. That's an educational environment that I would like children to be in. Now, I don't know how we're going to change the system in schools, but as parents, the power of asking unasked questions, coming out of predictability and coming out of routine and moving into uncertainty. So, let's talk a little bit about anxiety. What's the most important relationship you'll ever have? Who is it with? Yourself. Okay? Yes, but more to the point, it's with your thoughts. Your thoughts are your constant companion. They impact you far more than your parents, your children, your spouse, your lover, your best friends. Are your thoughts your ally, or are your thoughts your critic? Now, developing a healthy relationship with your thoughts is the key to understanding anxiety and overcoming it. Anxiety, simply put, is when your thoughts attach to fear. Now, the fear may be real, but in most cases, the fear is constructed. When thoughts attach to fear, you experience anxiety. Now, Fear of failure, fear of making a mistake, fear of not being as popular as my friends, fear of not getting good enough grades, fear of disappointing mom or dad, fear of not getting into good enough colleges. All those fears create distress and anxiety. Now, I'm not proposing a laissez-faire attitude where we don't work hard. That creates stress. Stress is good. Stress is productive. Stress is exhilarating. I feel stress right now. But when stress turns into distress and calcifies, that is fear and that is anxiety. So if you have children who you believe struggle with anxiety, number one, anxiety can be overcome. And anxiety can be overcome and need not be treated by meds. And in fact, of all medications, I'm most concerned about medication for anxiety because it creates a message that I can't handle this without the medication. There's a way to teach children and adults how to overcome anxiety by changing your relationship with your thoughts. I gave a TEDx talk on this called Breaking Free from Anxiety. I recommend that if you're interested in this topic, you take a look at it. There are simple, focused ways to overcome anxiety for yourself. And by the way, if you struggle with anxiety and go to work on it and model that for your children, what a blessing. And as you make progress, to share that progress with them, double blessing. Fear of failure, fear of mistakes. Rethink it. There's no such thing as failure. There's no such thing as a mistake. Obviously, there are mistakes. Drinking too much and going out driving is a mistake. But I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the freedom from worrying about what others think. I think I was in third grade and there was an art class I was in. And I'll never forget, I painted someone, or I used a crayon, I painted someone with blue hair, and my teacher made fun of me. And that was it for my artistic ability. I felt humiliated. Now, depression. Remember, depression is basically a disconnect. It's a disconnect from meaning and purpose. It's a disconnect from wonder and curiosity. I have had people, going back to the anxiety and the fear of failure, share with me, again, that their grades aren't good enough to get into the college they want to and they feel like a failure. And I may ask them, you ever hear of Albert Einstein? Of course I've heard of him. I say, you know Einstein's story? In college, his math teacher famously or infamously said, he's never going to amount to anything. Einstein was a clerk in a patent office when he developed the theory of relativity. So was Einstein a failure or the greatest mind of the century? Give the kids the ability to throw away the labels and the diagnoses and think for themselves. The only failure is in believing that you're not good enough. That's the failure. So, we need to teach our children emotional intelligence. We need to teach our children authentic self-esteem, which means to whatever extent that we don't prosper in that way, we need to start to learn. How do you do that? Well, I have resources I can offer you. Go to my website, many articles, podcasts on these topics. One podcast in particular called Developing Authentic Self-Esteem can be very helpful. I'm going to be moving into the last part of the talk, which is about communication. But before I do, any questions on anything we've covered? Yes?
How about the oversensitive child, someone who's very sensitive, almost like an empath?
Okay, so let's break that out between being an empath or oversensitive. Because generally, whenever we say to someone, you're too sensitive, that is nullifying. The question would be, what are you feeling so sensitive about? But you're saying here, it's not just sensitive, it's an empath. They're very tuned into other feelings. So that is a very unusual experience. Most people are not empaths, so it's a very particular experience. So an empath is struggling to have enough barrier between themselves and the other. And they feel this need that they have to tend to the other, right? And to make sure that they're okay. That sets up a codependency. So again, it's a fine line. What I would say is that what you want to do is share with that child that sensitivity and caring and compassion is fine, but they need to maintain their own balance. Otherwise, they'll get lost, as empaths do. But we should never tell our children, or anyone, you're too sensitive. That's the end of what could be a reasonable discussion. You're too sensitive. What that really means ordinarily, I'm not talking about a child who's an empath, but when we say to someone, you're too sensitive, what it means is, I don't want to hear this. Don't bother me. You're too sensitive. In any relationship, the breakthrough is this. Do you love me? Well, of course I love you. Now, this can be your spouse. It can be a child asking a parent. Do you love me? Of course I love you. So if you love me, do you care how I feel? That's it. And there will be a distraction. They'll try to get you into an argument. Don't go for the bait. Come right back to it. No. Do you care how I feel? Because if you don't care how I feel, then that's not loving, is it? Now, how do we help children express what they feel? Number one, we surrender the need to be right. Feelings and right or wrong exist in different universes. It doesn't mean we won't get to move into rethinking, re-educating, but first, we have to let go of right or wrong. We should never say to a kid who's objecting to what we're telling them to do, why should I do that, Dad? Because I said so. That doesn't create respect. Respect is misunderstood. Respect comes from tuning into someone's feelings. Ultimately, as a parent, you may have to dictate what will be done even if they don't agree. But you do that with sensitivity and with caring. I'm sorry you don't see this the way I see this, but at your age, I still have to do what I think is best for you. And we can continue to talk about it, but this is what you have to do. Respect. Respect comes from, I think it's a French word, respecter, which means to look again. To look again in communication means to try to understand the other's perception, what they're feeling, and what they're experiencing. So respect is not authority-based or fear-based. Respect is a mutual process. If I respect you, then the likelihood is you will respect me. Years ago, I made up something which I call the 5% rule. I did this for couples counseling, but it's applicable in parenting as well. The 5% rule is when you're in an argument, the tendency, the inclination is to repudiate and refute anything you hear that you don't agree with. And it goes nowhere. So paradoxically, I had a thought, which is you can probably find some small percentage of what you're hearing that you agree with. Let's call it 5%. I said, let's take the 95% you don't agree with and put it up on the shelf for now. Find the 5% and validate it. Now, that other person feels validated. They feel surprised. They feel respected. Now, what happens when they feel that way? They're now prepared to take in what you have to say. You see, when you validate, and validating is not, I mimic back to you the words I just heard. That's nonsense. Validate is a deep understanding. It's inquiring as to why you feel that way. When I validate, then I can pivot and educate. So it can't be, yes, I appreciate how you feel, but you move into it. And then some minutes or sometime later, you then pivot because you've joined together. There's mutual respect. You're hearing each other. Then you can share other information. You can do this in relationship with anyone. This evening we're talking primarily about our children. So the 5% rule, very effective. There's another concept in communication which I focus on, and I call it shared meaning. Shared meaning is we use words and phrases as though they mean the same thing to all of us, and they don't. It is so vitally important with one another, with our children, when we use a word or a phrase, to ask them, what does that mean to you? What does it mean to me? That's a shared inquiry, it's shared meaning. It slows down the pace. It's fertile ground for developing authentic relationship, authentic self-esteem, and it's fertile for learning and insights. What does it mean? People argue with each other, and I know that the word means one thing to him and one thing to her, and they're off to the races arguing. It's time out. What does that word mean to you? Happened very memorably for me doing a couples session, and she says to her husband, you don't know how to be intimate. I don't know how to be intimate. Are you kidding? I'm the intimate one. I said, time out, guys. What do you each mean by intimate? Not surprisingly, he was referring to physical intimacy. She was referring to emotional intimacy, and they would have gone off forever in this fight, and they're talking two different languages. So as parents, particularly with children, we should not assume the word or the phrase at their age means the same thing to them that it means to me. Slow down the process. Shared meaning, shared inquiry. Last principle of communication, the art of listening, which is comparable to the art of dialogue. The art of listening is to not interrupt. It's to pace yourself, again by asking more questions, but listening requires stilling my own inner voice and my own thoughts so I can be present. If you can model that for your children, being present, validating, being emotionally intimate, you will be providing them with the bulwark, with the groundswell of what they need to thrive in their lives and be resilient. Again, this does not get in the way of their academic achievement. It bolsters it. All we have to do is look at how many brilliant young college students have committed suicide to understand that academic achievement in and of itself is not necessarily consistent with happiness or well-being. So rewrite the rule book. Now I know what I'm proposing may sound sensible and provocative, but it's achievable. The resources are there for you, and again, it's what we model. It's who we are. It's not what we say. And we are imperfect, and we have more learning and growing to do, hopefully, until we take our last breath, because that's what we're here for. So share that with them. Model that, and develop a new relationship with the kids. Any other questions? Yes?
My kids are not of the age that
That's sensible. In my generation, it was about too much television. So, but what I think is important in social media is to discuss the concept of peer pressure. And the peer pressure is around social media, how many followers you have, how many likes you have. In school, how many friends you have. Is your best friend getting better grades than you? Peer pressure is in absolute opposition to authentic self-esteem. So I would set whatever you feel is reasonable boundaries, but in addition to that, get underneath it, which is if your child is going to start to quantify and measure themselves. By the way, that's one piece I left out. Anxiety and low self-esteem is due primarily to our thoughts measuring and comparing ourselves with others. So we judge ourselves, and then we presume others are judging us. We project the judgment. So in social media or in all aspects of childhood, measuring of yourself is harmful. Now, I'm not proposing that you don't tune in, take stock of yourself and what you're feeling, but measuring is harmful. What you want to do is check how you're feeling and how you're doing, but not measure. So one of the problems with social media is it sets up the experience of measuring, right? Grades set up the experience of measuring, and that's, I guess, a necessary evil until we come to a place when it isn't. Help your kids not measure themselves. Measuring does harm. Measuring is the opposite of genuine, authentic self-esteem. Any other questions? Yes?
I have a 16-year-old, and I would say we're kind of hands-off and allow the kids to be self-sufficient, so kind of empowering. But what I find is, I think part of where we live, there's a lot of pressure. There's a lot of pressure on being successful and getting into the right school, and pressure to be in better classes. So what I find myself doing is telling a child, I don't care where you go to school. It doesn't matter, your grades don't matter. Like, I surprise myself in saying that, because I never thought I would say that. But it just doesn't seem to be enough. And I think the overscheduling comes from the child wanting to do it. The child wants to not give up a sport or driving or honors or tutoring or etc. So, and I've shared stories, and I've done a lot of the right things, but at the end of the day, how do you get a kid to not care as much? Because I really do think it's coming from the friends. There's a different type of peer pressure around here, I think.
Yeah.
And I heard a college counselor describe it as the fear of failure in Fairfield County. And I think it's one of the blessings, but it's also a little bit of the curse of where we live.
Yeah.
So,
Well,
that was a long question.
it sounds like you're an anomaly, and credit to you, and you're doing the best you can, and you can't really control it. What you might say is, if you reach the point in life where you're struggling with your meaning and purpose and happiness, it's never too late to rethink these things. If you want to go out there and compete now on all levels, I can't stop you. You're autonomous, you're 16 years old. I've shared my opinions and values. I can't imprison you. But if you ever run into a wall, just remember it's not too late to re-navigate. So provide your child with that opportunity going forward in anticipation of it, because it will likely happen.
I left out the most important point. She has a lot of anxiety.
So
it's
So when I'm working with kids who sound like your daughter, there's an enormous amount of anxiety. How could there not be, right? So the important thing to move into there is their belief that if they don't get into a good enough school, they're a failure. Move into the belief, because they're stating it as the truth, as a fact. Move into the belief. Why would you think that's failure? Again, the Einstein illustration, or countless other illustrations of remarkably successful and admirable people who probably went to a lesser school than she's going to go to. In other words, in life, when something is put forth as the truth, in almost all circumstances, it's really just a belief. So the way to unravel this with kids and adolescents would be, how did you come to that belief? Well, that's what all my friends say. But how did they all come to it, right? Let's move into a discussion around consensual reality. So if everyone's going to go off the edge of the cliff, you want to go off too? So to give them the autonomy to think for themselves. Yes?
Something I read about recently that would probably help a teenager in Fairfield County is to get away from this anxiety and depression is give them something to work towards, like working in an area where there is poverty or helping a cause. Like once a kid has a cause, it kind of gives them more like that meaning and purpose.
Yes, absolutely. To get out of the silo of your own particular environment, and one of affluence, if that's the circumstance. Lack of meaning and purpose is profound in our culture. My book, The Possibility Principle, indicates why. It's because we're playing from the wrong game plan of life, actually one that was given to us by 17th century thinkers who told us reality is like a giant machine. That's Newton's machine-like universe. We all studied Newton when we were in school. But we live in that way, which gives us nothing to do but to compete and to win. And there isn't meaning and purpose because we operate from this sense of disconnection. You see, in quantum physics, which is now 100 years old, reality is described as inseparable. Actually, the hard science is telling us what spiritual traditions always said. Reality is one indivisible, inseparable whole. Now, that may sound counterintuitive, but it seems to be so. If that's the case, then compassion and empathy rise to the surface. Because if we are all as one, then I care for you and how you are. Because benefiting you benefits me. So we're operating from this rule of isolation and separation, and there's no meaning or purpose there. All we can do is compete. That's why we see the horror of such runaway greed. Making a lot of money isn't an issue, but greed. Self-interested greed at the expense of others, it's tragic. It's what harms so much of us. So we always want to develop meaning and purpose and take on hard questions. I've worked with kids who have a profound existential fear of death. Teens. Do you ever discuss it with your mom or dad? No. They ever discuss it with you? No. You've kept it a secret? Uh-huh. What's wrong there? We need to talk to each other about this. Profound issue in many people's lives, but we keep it a secret. We need to open it up. Last question?
So Mel, a lot of the excellent points you bring up today that we could share with our children are very different from what the school shares with our children and therefore their peers at school. So most of our children spend most of their day at school and then a lot of their day with peers in sports, etc. And I think the problem is we all move to a town like Weston for the excellent schools, and the excellent schools are geared towards grades and college, competition, and doing well. So it's just the opposite of what we're talking about today. How do you balance and telling our kids, whether they're, from Hurlbut straight up to high school, that the qualities that we're talking about today matter versus what you're learning in school all day? And that is a very hard balance because that's what they're here for. Or that's what parents move here for, to put these kids in this journey and this channel and this lane. And what we're really talking about today is that lane is not going to develop an emotionally sound child.
Excellent question, Jess. I love getting questions that I don't have immediate answers for because it drives me into authenticity. It's like, all right, let me think about that. I think that we need to actually speak directly to that. We decided to raise you in a community like this because of the great school system. We want you to have the opportunities to achieve to the best of your ability if that's what you choose, and succeed academically, and perhaps career-wise and financially. But I, as your parent, need to share something with you that you're not getting from your teachers. This is not your teacher's fault. I have to give you a message that you don't get in your school. And that message is if you want to thrive in your life, not just succeed, you need to develop a deeper foundation of your relationship with yourself. You need to develop your own values and meaning and purpose. And again, one doesn't preclude the other. At that point, they may say, well, what do you mean? What does that look like? And maybe you have some anecdotes or a narrative that you can share or something you have heard of from someone else. But we need to move into it. We have to embrace the uncertainty of not knowing the answer. Not knowing the answer is fine. Let's work on it together. Let's contemplate it. Let's stimulate each other. Embrace uncertainty. So if I don't have the answer, it doesn't mean I don't dive in. And if I'm asked, well, how do I do that? Why should I do that? I'm not sure. I think it's important, We'll talk about it more. You think about it, I'll think about it. We'll move back into it. We have to become comfortable with not having answers and embrace that uncertainty and trust that something is going to percolate. Just trust it will come. One last question, if there is one. Okay, folks, thank you for coming. Thank you for braving the fears. Use the hand sanitizer on the way out. And if you have any further questions, don't hesitate to send me an email. Listen to the podcast, read the articles. Good night, all.